Grannycrat, a word you don't hear much these days. In fact, unless you were born sometime during the first half of the 19th century and were around for William Henry Harrison's 1840 presidential election campaign, you probably haven't heard that word at all. So let's go back to 1840 to find out how it applies to our political reality today. William Henry Harrison was picked to run as candidate for the Whig Party in his 1840 election. Harrison was the oldest candidate ever to run for president, and the Democrats seized on this. They called him Granny Harrison and Petticoat General in reference to his service in the War of 1812. He was so old that he was a woman. One paper said, Mrs. Harrison of Ohio is undoubtedly a very excellent matron, but if we must take a woman president, let's have youth and beauty, and not age and imbecility. Give him a barrel of hard cider and settle a pension of $2,000 a year on him, and take my word for it, he will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin. While that doesn't actually sound like a bad deal, Harrison was apparently not quite ready for his idyllic retirement. So in response to the Democrats' taunting, the Natchez Daily Courier said, one of the arguments by which a certain class of politicians attempt to put down every man who has passed the meridian of life is that he is an old granny. Rather than shying away from mentions of his advanced age, the Whigs decided to embrace it. The Harrison campaign held log cabin and hard cider rallies where they passed out free hard cider, the people's drink of the day, according to one paper of the time, and rolled log cabins on wheels down city streets. So these lively celebrations, which they said was unbecoming for a presidential candidate, seemed to underscore the point the Whigs were trying to make. Harrison wasn't old, he was instead experienced and decorated. Even so, his age was such a liability that Harrison felt the need to respond more than once, saying in 1839, I deem it proper at this time to renew the assurance heretofore frequently made that should I be elected to the presidency, I will under no circumstances consent to be a candidate for a second term. And Harrison made good on that promise because he died of pneumonia. Potentially from a contaminated water tap at the White House just 3 weeks after being inaugurated. He was 67. Harrison, the old granny, or Granny Harrison if you prefer, was only 7 years older than Kamala Harris is now. So from 2025, Harrison seems almost young, because this past summer, President Biden dropped out of the race at the last minute due to apparently unforeseen oldness at 81. His successor, President Trump, is a full 10 years older than Granny Harrison at 78.
An enormous, really an enormous.
And the entire government is really just helmed by grannycrats from both parties, and ostensibly always has been. In 1883, 80-year-old Justice of the Peace Samuel K. Taylor was declared too old to be a justice. Another from 1906, prospective presidential candidate, 72-year-old Speaker of the House Joseph Gurney Cannon was too old to run. And then there are the old grannies who weren't just old, but who experienced demonstrable mental decline. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke at the age of 62, and the First Lady Edith all but assumed the title of president, though the public was not made aware of this. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas refused to immediately retire from his post after suffering a stroke in 1974, which left him partially paralyzed and cognitively impaired, so much so that members of the court made the decision to delay cases where his vote would have a major impact until he finally retired the following year. Ronald Reagan, of course, who many believe to have been suffering from dementia during his second term, struggled through his first debate with 56-year-old Walter Mondale. And a headline from the Wall Street Journal after the debate asked, "New question in race. Is oldest US president now showing his age?" In their second debate, 2 weeks later, Reagan addressed this by saying,
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Reagan was 77 when his second term ended, and he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 5 years later after leaving office. When you might not know, during his re-election campaign, the fact that President Eisenhower would be 70 by the end of his second term became an election issue. President defended, Bolton denies Eisenhower is too old to run again. Okay, so trying to remedy some of this. In the 92 election, ballot initiatives imposing term limits on Congress were on ballots in 14 states. For the Senate, the term limit was set at 12 years, and for the House, the term limit was set between 6 and 12 years. All 14 voted in favor of setting term limits, only to be rebuffed by the Supreme Court in 1995. So no progress there, and thus Grannycrats carried on through a group of older politicians, mostly Southern Democrats, who refused to step down despite appearing unfit to carry out the duties of office and were often seen as just hampering social progress. Strom Thurmond clung to his Senate seat until 2003 at the age of 100, with the help of staffers who managed his every move. Robert Byrd served in the Senate despite similar reliance on staffers until he died in office in 2010 at the age of 92, and another quintessential Grannycrat, Representative John Dingell, served in the House for 59 years before retiring in 2015. Even more recently, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in her post at 87, leaving her vacancy to be filled by Amy Coney Barrett, as did Dianne Feinstein, whose obvious lack of fitness for office raised serious concerns before she similarly died in office at 90. But that's all in the past. We have our own partially alive Grannycrats to contend with. Nancy Pelosi recently broke her hip after falling in Luxembourg while there in part to commemorate the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, a battle she was alive for. She's 84. And on the Republican side, Mitch McConnell, or Glitch McConnell as he's come to be known around my apartment, now almost routinely freezes up while speaking and has fallen on several occasions, leading to at least one concussion, a fractured shoulder and rib, a sprained wrist, and we can assume a bruised ego. He is 81, and Bernie Sanders, still the leading voice of the left, who suffered a heart attack during his last run for president, he's 83. So clearly, though, this has always been a problem in American politics, right? I mean, it certainly feels, especially after this near exhaustive rundown, like we've always lived under the frail thumb of a gerontocracy. However, these rather notable examples were the exceptions, not the rule. So if it feels to you like our representatives are just plain older now, you would be right. They are.
And a string of
In our 119th Congress, in the House, 44% are 60 or older, and then 20% are 70 or older. And then in the Senate, 67% of senators are 60 or older, and 34% are 70 or older. And in case you're thinking, well, of course, we're all simply living longer, as of 2025, only 17% of the population is 65 or older. Meanwhile, during the 1840s, the heyday of the Grannycrats, less than 1% of representatives were over the age of 70. Your average member of the House would have been in their early 40s, while your average senator would have been in their late 40s or early 50s. Ken Klippenstein, independent journalist publishing his newsletter via Substack, has been closely covering the gerontocracy beat, led by a cabal of entrenched, aging politicians he's named the Mothball Mafia. So how did we wind up living in the gerontocracy? When did 81 become the new 67?
Yeah, there are different factors. There's the more innocuous factor, which is just that people are living longer. Healthcare is getting better. It's becoming easier to keep people from dying as they grow into old age. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that you can keep their brains from dying, their brains from declining. And so you have a lot of people that are living into ages that they hadn't lived before. The relative decrease in in American lifespan notwithstanding, it's highly class stratified. And so these individuals have, better healthcare than most Americans have. They have more money. And so you mix that with the advances in health technology and you have a recipe for a much older age demographic in Congress.
Surely it's a good thing that, at least in theory, modern medicine allows us to keep our loved ones around for longer. However, it's also probably not great that modern medicine can obscure how much the aging process has impaired someone's cognitive function, especially when someone is charged with making decisions that affect everything from our well-being as working people to issues like national security.
I'm a national security reporter, and so people people sometimes ask me, they're like, how did you get into a gerontocracy beat? And the answer to that question is I stumbled into it. It wasn't intentional. I was reading a Rand Corporation report. That's the Pentagon-funded think tank that does a lot of defense and national security stuff. And I noticed one day that they had done a report on concerns about intelligence officials or people with access to classified and sensitive intelligence who have dementia. What do you do in that case? And it turns out, despite all the vetting, all the polygraphs and continuous vetting and procedures they have to make sure that people are not in a position, say, for example, you're in the intelligence community or you have access to intelligence, you have a security clearance, and you have a lot of debt. That can get your clearance pulled because then you're in a position where you can get blackmailed or you can need money, and there are a lot of risks. So they have all of these complicated and frankly kind of intrusive mechanisms they use to make sure that the people with the security clearances aren't at risk, except for one thing. They essentially have nothing for how to deal with if somebody's becoming senile or someone is experiencing cognitive decline. They don't have anything on the books to be able to handle that.
Okay, so this should be alarming to everyone. In Congress, the most sensitive, highly classified information is given only to a group of representatives known as the Gang of Eight.
If you only have 8 people that get read into all the secret stuff that the military and the intelligence community is doing, it's really important that those people be up to the job, so that they can know when they need to paraphrase something to press, or if something's a concern, and they can go and either discuss it with the rest of Congress, or find some way to make the information known to the public. And I thought to myself, just a couple of years ago, Nancy Pelosi would have been one of the Gang of Eight. Mitch McConnell, who we see glitching out, I think he's had like 3 incidents where he's just freezes in front of cameras and clearly is not doing well. All of these figures are like well into their 80s. And I thought of that Rand report and I thought, gosh, like to say nothing of the Pentagon and all these other agencies, just the elected officials that we see on TV, that we're supposed to see publicly every day, are very clearly not where they were, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Like, what's going on?
And the gerontocracy reigns over some frankly pretty important congressional committees as well. In the Senate, Chuck Grassley, 91, is chair of the Judiciary Committee, and Jerry Moran, 70, is the ranking member of the Committee on Veterans Affairs. In the House, Tom Cole, 75, is chair of the Appropriations Committee. Tim Walberg, 73, is chair of the Education and the Workforce Committee. And it continues on with 74-year-old Jerry Connolly, who informed the public 2 days after winning re-election in 2024 that he has esophageal cancer, which, as Klippenstein has noted, is usually extremely aggressive. He won his position as ranking member of the House Oversight Committee after being challenged by 35-year-old Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. On this, Connolly told CNN,
"I've never had my chance to be a ranking member or chairman of a full committee. This is it."
Now, whether he's able to completely fulfill the duties of this critical committee assignment is really besides the point, as is whether he's able to finish out his next term. And it would obviously be impolite to mention the consequences of his inability to do so.
There's a bunch of Congress people in their 70s, some in their 80s, who just don't really do press anymore. And you can guess why that is. So there's a lot of work and effort put into keeping the public not aware of what's going on. But in spite of that, I think people generally have a sense that there's something wrong. To the extent that the public is uneasy with it, I would say, is when you actually get in there and do some of this reporting. I looked at Texas Congresswoman Kay Granger, who was somewhere in her 80s, and turned out she was still in office in the previous term and had just relocated to a retirement facility, and they didn't tell anybody. And she wasn't seen anywhere in Washington for like months prior to this. I find it hard to believe that at least part of her party, if not, people generally didn't notice that she just wasn't around anymore. But they succeed through the deferent coverage that they get from the press not to ever talk about these things. But, the point I try to stress when people complain about it is like, this is not your aunt or this is not your grandmother. This is someone elected to public office.
When someone like Kay Granger is not only unable to fulfill the duties of office, but is living in an actual elder care facility while remaining in office, staffers are the ones who take up those responsibilities. They are overwhelmingly young, the average age being 31, and more often than not come from the top stratum of society. This makes sense. Wages for staffers are low and the cost of living in DC is high. So unless someone has income coming from somewhere else, like a wealthy parent or spouse, remaining in that position is going to be difficult. And there's no guarantee that unelected staffers will have an understanding of the constituency the politicians they work for represent. Late last year, Klippenstein also reported on an episode with 79-year-old Congressman and ranking member of the House Agriculture Committee, David Scott. Scott was photographed being pushed in his wheelchair by a staffer outside of the Capitol when he yelled at the photographer, "Who gave you the right to take a picture, asshole?" A public official in a public place, it might seem surprising that such an experienced politician wouldn't understand that the press doesn't need permission to take his picture. I wasn't surprised because I know something that's an open secret on Capitol Hill. He's senile.
Well, he have an effect on whether or not you will resume your plan to have.
So what happened to the idea that a reporter's job is to hold power to account, or at the very least, let the public know when something seems a bit off with one of our electeds?
Yeah, there's a systemic problem on the part of media, which is that Congress is a conduit for information. The congressional committees get a lot of information from the executive branch. They get information from their districts, from state and local government. And so the press is in a position where they want to rely on them for access, and they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them by having a story about, an 80-something. But I think that's essentially what's happening with the press. They want the exclusives. They want to be able to have, this senator come on their TV show. And also there's a kind of cultural affectation in Washington where just the older person you're supposed to show deference to, and they tend to get the committee assignments. And I think that kind of trickles down to the press, where they kind of inherit this, and it's very West Wing. When I lived in Washington for a number of years, there was so much emphasis on etiquette and decorum and respect, and this is the senior senator, and you're supposed to show them some deference.
And the thing about an open secret is that it's not really a secret. Someone, or rather a lot of someones over at Capitol Hill, have known that the congressman is no longer capable of fulfilling his duties. Why does this shambling mummy have a leadership position at all? You can thank what I call the mothball mafia. In 2022, when lawmakers tried to prevent Scott from leading the Agriculture Committee due to concerns about his physical decline, Nancy Pelosi, 84, Jim Clyburn, 84, and Steny Hoyer, 85, circled the wagons around Scott and insisted everything was fine. And when you've been in office for, say, 38 years, like Nancy Pelosi, longer than I've been alive, you've become entrenched. You've built a terrarium of power and wealth and connections, especially in regard to donors, and you're all the more difficult to defy and all the more difficult to remove. At the same time, the average cost of a congressional run has been steadily rising. In 1990, the average senator spent $3.8 million to win their seat. By the early 2000s, a Senate run would set you back close to $7 million. And by 2022, you would have been looking at around $27 million. Now, who could possibly afford this? Well, the old grannies heading up the mothball mafia can. That's who. So as the average cost of congressional elections has risen, so too has the average age of our representatives. And on the flip side, what do we make of representatives like Bernie Sanders, who, despite his age, remains one of our most popular politicians? Bernie has become an institution for working people, and while the Democrats appear to be doubling down on their strategy of never learning anything, 83-year-old Bernie has been on his Take on the Oligarchy tour, in which he's visiting working class districts that flipped from blue to red in the last election. But this reliance on a single person leaves his project on unsure footing when he, too, is long past the retirement age and has no clear successor. So what can we do if we care about our national security, the welfare of the working people of this country, feel uncomfortable with the idea of unelected staffers running the show, or simply don't want to endure the embarrassment of bearing witness to old grannies suffering the indignities born of the inexorability of old age?
But people debate all kinds of things. I mean, people always talk about age limits and things. I don't think that's necessary. I think that if you, as in the case with Biden, I mean, we have an example of the most powerful person in the country, maybe in the world, who was hell-bent on running for re-election, and he dropped out. Now, if you listen to him and his spokespeople, it's out of deep love for the country, and he's overflowing with love for the people or whatever. I'm a little skeptical of that, and if I'm right, and it wasn't that reason that he dropped out, which I don't see why he wouldn't have dropped out sooner and allowed there to actually be a serious primary election, then what we have is an example of the most powerful person you can imagine being pressured by public opposition. And what that says is that public pressure alone is enough to succeed at this. I mean, if you can get a president not to run again, conceivably you can get a representative, you can get a mayor, you can get whoever. It's the public pressure that needs to be there.
And that will do it for me. My name is Spencer Snyder. If you found this video interesting, make sure you are subscribed to Breaking Points. You can find me on Twitter, I won't say X. Liking and sharing always helps. Thank you to Breaking Points. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.